Hello students, here is the video for the poems from week 3. Let's start with Robert Hayden's poem, Those Winter Sundays. Sundays too my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know, what did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? The first line of this poem is trochaic pentameter, which is like backward iambic pentameter. And you don't need to know those terms, but if you listen to it and you listen to iambic pentameter, you'll be able to see the difference. Remember, iambic pentameter is the traditional meter of a sonnet. So in this poem, the first line is, Sundays too my father got up early. And if we clap on the stress, it would be, Sundays too my father got up early. The word got, we could argue, maybe shouldn't be stressed, but it's close enough for this to be trochaic pentameter. There are 5 stresses, and the feet are stressed, unstressed. If we were to read this as though it were iambic pentameter, it would sound like this. Sundays to my father got up early, which is wrong, right? We wouldn't read it like that. So the first line is basically backward iambic pentameter. The first, second, fourth, ninth, and 14th lines have 10 syllables, and again, the 10-syllable line is what we would expect from a sonnet. And if we think about the way it sounds, other than the meter, we have a repeated k sound, which is called a velar plosive. You don't need to know that either, but just know that there's a repeated k sound that interrupts the rhythm in many lines, and that repetition fades away when the rooms warm up in this narrative. They're still there, especially we see the chronic angers of that house, and the word cold down here. But up in the first stanza and the first half of the second stanza, they're very present. Clothes, blue, black, cold, cracked hands, ached, weekday, banked, thanked. All of those repetitions, the repeated K sound and hard C sound, interrupt the rhythm. They make it harder to read this poem smoothly. Going back to the form, most of these lines contain a full clause or full sentence. There are a few exceptions. Cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather made. This line, the 4th line here, stands out. It's not a complete thought. It does change the way we think about the previous line, so it's okay. And it describes the kind of labor that the father does in this narrative. So that's fine. Almost all of the lines end on an interesting word or a word that makes us think. The exception, again, is that 4th line where the word made is not an interesting or strong word. It does set us up with some anticipation for what's going to come on the next line. So again, okay. Let's take a look, though, at this as a sonnet, which I argue it is. First off, it has 14 lines, and the word love is used explicitly. There's also a volta. The first 12 lines are a narrative of what happens on winter Sundays. Sundays too, my father got up early, so every other day as well, my father got up early, and then he did this task to make the speaker's life easier. And then the final 2 lines make a turn. Instead of telling a narrative, Our speaker is in the present, looking back, saying, "What did I know? What did I know of love's austere," which is stern or strict, and lonely offices. So our speaker has, in the time between those Sundays and now, the time when they are reciting this love poem, they have learned something about love. Maybe now they recognize what their father did as love, even though their life wasn't a happy one all the time. You know, the house was chronically angry. There were chronic angers. People were angry a lot of the time. But still, getting up early to take care of the family, to start the fire, getting up early on other days to go and labor in the weekday weather, all of this is a kind of love. Paul Muldoon's Why Brownlee Left. Why Brownlee left and where he went is a mystery even now. For if a man should have been content, it was him. 2 acres of barley, 1 of potatoes, 4 bullocks, a milker, a slated farmhouse. He was last seen going out to plough on a March morning, bright and early. By noon Brownlee was famous. They had found all abandoned, with the last rig unbroken, his pair of black horses, like man and wife, shifting their weight from foot to foot and gazing into the future. All right, we already talked about the meter in the beginning in the last video, so go back and check that out if you skipped it. This poem is 14 lines. It has an octave or 8-line stanza and a sestet, which is a 6-line stanza, which is like the Italian sonnet form, but this poem doesn't really follow the Italian sonnet's rhyme scheme. Speaking of rhyme scheme, is there rhyming work going on here? And can our rhyming work tell us whether this is really a sonnet or not? I see went and content. Now rhymes with plow. We'll come back and talk about this next week, and maybe we'll be able to figure out whether or not this is actually a sonnet. Here we have a poem that is definitely not a sonnet, but it is Richard Kenny's Aubade. And if you'll remember from the Larkin poem, an aubade is a song between 2 lovers who are parting at dawn. Cold snap, 5 o'clock. Outside, a heavy frost, dark footprints in the brittle grass, a cat's. Quick coffee, jacket, watch cap, keys. Stars blaze across the black gap between the horizons. Pickup somehow strikes its own dim spark. An arc starts. Inside, familiar metal cab, an icebox full of lightless air, limbs green with dashlight. Vinyl seat cracks, cold and brittle. Horn ring gleams, and chrome cuts hard across the wrist where the sleeve falls off the glove as Moontrack curves its cool tiara somewhere underneath your sleep this very moment, love. Examining this poem, we see a lot of short lines and short clauses, not even complete sentences in a lot of cases, and some abrupt interjections. So if we count syllables, if we look at the way the lines are set up with punctuation, there's not really a pattern. There's more frequent punctuation, so very jerky speech, and plosive consonants. If you'll remember earlier, I talked about velar plosives. The k sound is a velar plosive. Any type of plosive is where your breath bursts out of your mouth when you make a sound, and it's almost always a consonant sound. P is an example. P, you feel a puff of breath after that. T is the same. Those are all plosives. So that breaks up your speech. It makes it harder to speak smoothly. And the same thing goes for punctuation. If you have these short phrases, short clauses, short sentences, it makes your speech very jerky. But if you listen to the change in sound at the end of this poem, you'll see a difference, or hear anyway, a difference. Vinyl seat cracks, cold and brittle, horn ring gleams, and chrome cuts hard across the wrist where the sleeve falls off the glove as Moontrack curves its cool tiara somewhere underneath your sleep this very moment, love. So first off, we can see that the punctuation just kind of drifts away in those final lines. There's an awful lot of it up above, but we have much less of it there in those final 5 or 6 lines. Also, the repeated plosive consonants, the p, k, t, all of those sounds, there are some in the last few lines, but there are far fewer of them. And what's happening in our narrative at that point? Our speaker has risen from bed. It's 5 o'clock. There's been a cold snap. They see a cat's dark footprints in the brittle grass, so we know that the grass is stiff with frost. Our speaker gets quick coffee. They put on their jacket. They put on a watch cap, grab their keys. They see the stars in the sky. They get in a pickup. It starts, but maybe with difficulty. It says somehow strikes its own dim spark. So we can maybe hear the engine of that pickup straining to start and then starting. Inside the cab of the pickup is cold. It's an ice box full of lightless air. And then the dashboard lights up and the whole outside limbs is outlined, limbs green with dash light. The vinyl seat is cracking under the speaker's weight. It's cold and brittle. The horn ring, the ring on the steering wheel, gleams, and the chrome of the steering wheel is cutting our speaker's wrist, where their sleeve has fallen away from the glove, leaving that bare skin to touch the cold of the chrome. And our speaker's mind is drawn back to their lover that they left at 5 a.m. as Moontrack curves its cool tiara somewhere underneath your sleep this very moment, love. And we're drawn back then to the warmth that our speaker left, just as their mind is drawn back. And the sound, that smooth, the sound getting smoother and easier to read, that shows us the speaker's mood changing, or the speaker's mood softening as they think again about the person that they've left. All right, 2 more poems. First is W.B. Yeats' No Second Troy. Why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery, or that she would of late have taught to ignorant men most violent ways, or hurled the little streets upon the great, had they but courage equal to desire? What could have made her peaceful, with a mind that nobleness made simple as a fire, with beauty like a tightened bow, a kind that is not natural in an age like this, being high and solitary and most stern? Why, what could she have done being what she is? Was there another Troy for her to burn? And now we have Mary Jo Salter's No Second Try, which starts with an epigraph. Why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery, from W.B. Yeats's No Second Troy. An epigraph is a quotation at the beginning of a literary work that in a lot of cases sets the theme. Here, I think Salter included it to make sure that people go back and read Yeats's No Second Troy before they approach this poem. Why should I blame him that he filled his days with mistresses, or that he came home late to meet most ignorant trust with smiling ways, such thoughtful gifts and claims that I looked great, whatever that meant, though clearly not desire. What help if I'd been wiser, with a mind simply to hurl his laundry in the fire, rather than buy his tall tales with a kind solicitude and a deluded kiss, having cleaned his house from stem to stern? Why, who else could he use, a guy like this? Was there another wife for him to spurn? A few things about these poems. Most of the time, I think it's important to remember that poets are not writing from their own perspective, that usually they are taking on someone else's persona. Sometimes, though, that is not the case. And in these cases, it is speculated very heavily that Yeats here is writing about a particular woman who did not want to have a long-term relationship with him, who turned down his proposals of marriage multiple times, and was allegedly responsible for stirring up a lot of violence from the Irish Republican Army. In Mary Just Salter's case, there is a lot of speculation that this is about her now ex-husband who cheated on her for over a decade. So they're both writing about, or it is speculated again, that they're both writing about things that happened in their own lives. And you can draw a lot of parallels between what happens in these poems and what happened in the poet's own lives. So again, you can't always say that the poet is writing about themselves, but here you can speculate that it might be the case. So these are both poems about failed love, or love that is not fully returned. And I am going to try to make the argument that these are sonnets. So we have a few ways in which they are sonnets. They're love poems. They're about failed love, like I was saying. They're mostly iambic pentameter with various substitutions, but again, perfect iambic pentameter is less common. They also share a rhyme scheme with the beginnings of Shakespearean and English, or English sonnets. Shakespearean and English sonnets, that's just a different term for the same thing. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and they don't have the final couplet. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. We're going to talk more about rhyme schemes next week. So those are all ways that these two poems are like sonnets. There are, though, ways that they are not like sonnets. The first is that they're 12 lines instead of 14. They don't have that final couplet, the GG ending of the rhyme scheme from a Shakespearean sonnet. They also don't have a volta. If you look back at these poems, you'll see that our speaker in No Second Try is asking from the beginning, why should I blame him? Was there another wife for him to spurn? There's no turn here. And in Yeats, it's the same thing. Why should I blame her? Was there another Troy for her to burn? There is no turn there as well. But I would argue that these are sonnets in the sense that they are incomplete love. There's no volta, there's no turn, because the objects of this love, the people that our speakers are talking about, never changed their ways. They never returned this love. So, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe these are just poems that are very sonnet-like, but not actual sonnets. And that's fine too, if it's not quite a love poem, because there's not quite love there.